At our anniversary party, my husband announced, "I'm leaving you tonight." What I uncovered about his double life shocked the entire crowd. There are moments in life you think you've prepared for, or at least imagined enough times that if they did happen, you'd know what to do. But there are some things you can never prepare for. Like your husband announcing, at your own anniversary party, that he's leaving you. I remember the day like it was yesterday, and sometimes, it feels like I'm still standing there in that hotel ballroom, looking around at the people I thought were my closest friends and family, all staring at me as if I'd been the one to let them down. All staring at me, shocked and heartbroken, like I was some character in a tragic play. But it wasn't a play. It was real life. My life. The evening had started perfectly. The Waverly Hotel ballroom in Boston was breathtaking, exactly as I'd imagined when I'd spent weeks poring over every detail, making sure our 20th anniversary celebration would be something to remember. The jazz band was playing softly in the background, just the right volume to make conversation easy, and the flowers, peonies and hydrangeas, the same as we'd had at our wedding, filled the room with the softest, sweetest scent. I wanted everything perfect, and I thought it was. But even in the midst of all that beauty, something had felt wrong. Eric had been acting off. Not just that night, but for months, if I'm being honest. We'd been married for 20 years, and you get to know a person deeply, in ways they might not even know themselves. So, when he started making excuses to stay late at work, when he seemed distant at home, I knew something wasn't right. I'd ask him, gently at first, if everything was okay. And he'd just wave me off, muttering, "Just stressed, just work. Don't worry." But tonight was supposed to be special. I told myself he was probably just nervous, maybe even overwhelmed by the big event. He'd always been the quiet type, not one for crowds or public speaking, and I thought that must be it. So, I gave him a warm smile as he glanced at me from across the room, holding a drink a bit too tightly, and tried to push the unease aside. As the evening went on, Eric disappeared more than once, and I found myself greeting our guests and accepting congratulations alone. My best friend, Clara, was the first to notice. "Hey, Elle," she whispered, leaning in as we hugged another couple. "Where's Eric? He's been AWOL all night." "Honestly?" I whispered back, shrugging with a forced smile. "He's being strange. Maybe he's just overwhelmed." She looked at me knowingly, giving my arm a reassuring squeeze. "Well, he better snap out of it. It's his night too." I gave her a weak smile, feeling a pang of something, embarrassment, worry, maybe even shame, that I couldn't quite shake. Finally, I saw Eric come back into the ballroom, looking, well, honestly, like hell. He hadn't shaved, and his suit was wrinkled, which was bizarre for him. Eric was always meticulously groomed. I remember the odd feeling in the pit of my stomach when he walked over, looking almost nervous, but not in the shy way. This was different, almost like he was bracing himself. "You okay, Eric?" I asked, reaching out to touch his arm, feeling how tense it was under my hand. Yeah, I'm fine, Elle," he said, giving me a small, forced smile. But his eyes flickered away, and he was fidgeting, glancing around the room like he was searching for an escape. "Let's just get through this, okay?" he muttered, almost under his breath. I swallowed hard, taken aback. "What do you mean, get through this? This is our anniversary, Eric. This is supposed to be a celebration." He let out a sigh, his face softening a bit. "I know. Sorry. He trailed off, and I felt a cold, creeping fear slink through me, but I brushed it off. This was just Eric. Maybe he'd had too much to drink, or maybe he was just stressed. I told myself he'd loosen up after a while. But he didn't. The longer the evening went on, the more I felt him pulling away, his silences becoming heavier and harder to ignore. And then, as the band began playing our song, the song we'd danced to at our wedding, he suddenly stood up, raising his glass in a gesture that felt strange, almost mechanical. The crowd quieted, turning to look at him with expectant smiles. I gave him a gentle nudge, whispering, "Go on, say something sweet," and grinned at him, but his face was pale, unreadable. Eric cleared his throat, gripping his glass so hard I thought it might break. He stumbled, his voice wavering. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. 20 years, it's a long time, isn't it?" There was a polite chuckle from the crowd, but a few people glanced at each other, sensing the awkwardness. I smiled, waiting for him to continue, hoping he'd settle into a warm, heartfelt speech like he usually did. But instead, he looked directly at me, his eyes dark and distant, like he was seeing someone else. "Eleanor, Elle," he said, his voice shaking. "We've had a good run, but, well, I think it's time I was honest with you. I'm leaving you. Tonight." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. I stared at him, frozen, my mouth half open, unable to process what he'd just said. Around us, the guests gasped, murmurs rippling through the crowd like the sound of waves crashing over me. What are you talking about, Eric?" My voice barely came out, a whisper that sounded more like a broken plea than a question. He looked down, almost shamefaced, before meeting my gaze again. I'm sorry, L. I met someone else. I've been lying to you for too long, and I can't keep doing it. The room fell silent, all eyes darting between us, waiting for my reaction. I felt like I'd been plunged into freezing water, the air sucked out of my lungs, leaving me cold and gasping. I reached out to steady myself, gripping the back of a chair, but the room was spinning, and I could barely think. You met someone else? I managed, choking on the words. Who, Eric? Who did you meet? His eyes darted to the side, almost as if he was ashamed to look at me. Her name is Alyssa. The name hit me like a slap to the face. Alyssa was our daughter Amanda's English teacher, for God's sake. She'd been over to our house, for parent-teacher meetings and even for dinner once. We'd laughed together. I'd welcomed her into our home, never once imagining that she'd been sneaking around with my husband. You're leaving me for Amanda's teacher? My voice was low, barely restrained, each word a mixture of rage, confusion, and disbelief. Eric had the decency to look embarrassed, his face reddening. He nodded, muttering, I didn't plan this, L. It just happened. It just happened? I echoed, my voice shaking with a mixture of fury and sorrow. For how long, Eric? How long have you been lying to me? To us? He swallowed, glancing around at the crowd, which was now hushed, staring at us like we were some twisted soap opera unfolding in front of them. About a year, he admitted, looking away. A year? My voice cracked, and I felt tears pricking at my eyes, blurring my vision as I stared at this man I thought I knew. You've been sneaking around for a year, coming home to me, to Amanda, and lying to us? Eleanor. He tried to reach out, but I flinched, taking a step back. No, I said, my voice louder than I'd intended. Don't you dare. Don't you dare act like you're the victim here. At that moment, the door opened, and in walked Amanda, our 17-year-old daughter. She looked around, confused, sensing the tension in the air. Her face changed when she saw me standing alone, her father standing across from me with that horrible, guilty expression. Mom? Dad? She asked, her voice trembling. What's going on? I looked at her, then at Eric, who looked away, his face pale and stricken. I could see he didn't want to be the one to break it to her, but I wasn't going to make it easy for him. Amanda, I said, my voice barely holding steady, your father has something to tell you. Eric shot me a pleading look, but I held my ground, crossing my arms as I stared at him, daring him to do what he'd just done to me. Amanda. He began, swallowing hard. Your mom and I, we're separating. Amanda's face fell, her expression turning to one of shock and betrayal as she looked between us. What? But, why? Eric shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her eyes. There's someone else, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I'm leaving with her tonight. Amanda's eyes filled with tears, and she let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth as she stared at her father in disbelief. You're leaving us? Just like that? He nodded, avoiding her gaze, and I watched as the last shreds of the man I thought I knew crumbled away. He'd planned this, schemed and lied, and here he was, ready to walk out the door without a second thought. Without another word, Eric turned and walked away, disappearing through the doors without looking back. As the last guests left, their faces filled with pity and sorrow, I was left in the empty ballroom, standing in the mess of wilted flowers and empty champagne glasses. Clara stayed with me, holding my hand as I trembled, the weight of it all crashing down on me like a tidal wave. The night ended in silence, punctuated only by the sound of my own broken sobs. In the days that followed, I dug through our finances, uncovering the extent of Eric's betrayal. He'd been funneling money into a separate account for months, preparing for his new life with Alyssa. The man I'd spent 2 decades with had been a stranger all along, hiding secrets and lies I could never have imagined. The divorce was quick and bitter, with Eric barely putting up a fight. He'd already moved on, and I was left picking up the pieces, trying to make sense of the wreckage he'd left behind. But somehow, through it all, I found a strength I didn't know I had. Years have passed, but I still think about that night, about the man who betrayed me and the life I thought we had. I've rebuilt myself, piecing my life back together bit by bit, and while the scars remain, they're a reminder of what I've survived. I learned that night that some people can lie to you with a smile, and sometimes, the person you thought you knew is nothing more than a stranger wearing a familiar face. In the months that followed Eric's departure, my life became a relentless cycle of lawyers, paperwork, and whispered conversations with friends and family who still couldn't believe the scandal that had rocked us all. But beneath the shock and sadness, something else had started to simmer, a cold, burning anger. It wasn't just his betrayal with Alyssa. It was the lies, the theft, and the humiliation of that night, of him turning our anniversary celebration into his dramatic exit. And as the anger grew, so did my resolve to make sure he didn't get away with it. I hired the best divorce attorney in Boston, a sharp woman named Diane Becker. Diane was known for her skill in cases involving hidden assets, something she excelled in with an almost predatory instinct. When I showed her the records I'd found of Eric's secret account, she grinned, a kind of excited gleam in her eye. "Let's get to work, Eleanor. I think Eric's about to have the worst year of his life." And Diane was right. We went after everything. I discovered that Eric and Alyssa were renting a luxury condo in Back Bay, the kind of place I'd always dreamed we'd have one day. When Eric and I got married, he'd been in med school and then working endless hours as a surgical resident. We'd agreed that I'd put my own ambitions on hold to raise Amanda and support him through those years. Now, he was living a life of luxury with the woman he'd thrown everything away for, and I was left cleaning up the pieces. Well, not anymore. Diane was relentless, combing through years of financial records, finding every hidden account, every asset he'd tried to stash away. She took him to court for spousal support, and thanks to the piles of evidence she'd collected, the judge awarded me everything we could legally squeeze out of him. Eric's lawyer argued he'd been supporting me while I built my interior design business, and that it was only fair I let go of spousal support. I remember sitting there in the courtroom, shaking my head at the irony. Diane was quick to respond, making it crystal clear that if anyone was owed fairness, it was me. By the time the divorce was finalized, I'd managed to secure ownership of our house, a generous chunk of his retirement savings, and spousal support that would allow me to live comfortably while rebuilding my business and my life. But that wasn't the revenge I was after. Not yet. After the divorce was settled, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I revamped my interior design business, Eleanor Grace Designs, pouring every ounce of myself into it. But I wasn't just working for myself, I had a little surprise cooking up for Eric and Alyssa. Amanda was still in her senior year, and Eric had hardly been around since he moved in with Alyssa. He had been so swept up in his new life that he was blind to the mounting consequences of his actions. And he had no idea that his little getaway with Alyssa would be the source of his downfall. You see, Amanda wasn't blind. She saw right through her father's behavior, the way he barely showed up to her school events anymore, his constant distractions when he did see her, and the total disregard he showed for the family he left behind. It hurt her deeply, and it only fueled my own determination to make sure Eric's fantasy life didn't last. Through a few friends in Amanda's school district, I quietly spread word about Alyssa's involvement with Eric. As luck would have it, the school had a strict ethics policy, and relationships with parents of students were heavily frowned upon. It wasn't long before rumors started circulating among the other teachers and eventually reached the administration. Alyssa was let go within a week. Now jobless and without the stability she thought she'd have in Boston, Alyssa started putting more pressure on Eric to take care of her, and I had a feeling that was going to be his undoing. Amanda, meanwhile, was distancing herself from her father more and more. The man who had abandoned his family was now suddenly dealing with a moody, resentful daughter who didn't have time for his excuses. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Amanda came to me with a heavy look on her face. "Mom," she started, hesitating. "Dad wants me to come over for dinner with him and, you know." She looked away, her lips pressed in a thin line. "You don't have to go, honey," I said gently, touching her shoulder. "If you're uncomfortable, just tell him." "I don't want to go, but he keeps calling, making me feel guilty," she admitted, her voice wavering. "Maybe if I go just once, he'll leave me alone for a while." I hugged her, feeling the sting of tears in my eyes. "Amanda, he made his choices. You don't owe him anything." That evening, Amanda went to his condo. I paced the house, trying not to think about what was happening. When she finally came home, her face was pale, her eyes glassy with anger. "What happened?" I asked, my heart sinking. He was going on and on about how he had a plan to build this amazing life with Alyssa and wanted me to be happy for him. "Mom, he thinks he can just erase what he did to us and expects me to be fine with it." That was the moment I knew it was time for the final part of my plan. Through a stroke of irony, I had become good friends with Clara's husband, Mike, who was a highly successful real estate agent. He happened to know that Eric and Alyssa's lease on their condo was coming up, and he shared that they were having financial struggles. Eric's lavish lifestyle was starting to catch up with him, especially since he was now responsible for significant alimony payments. And with Alyssa unable to find work because of her reputation, they were on the verge of being evicted. I decided to take a little trip to their condo, under the pretense of dropping off some of Amanda's things. When I arrived, Eric answered the door, looking surprised and, though he wouldn't admit it, a bit desperate. "Eleanor," he greeted, a forced smile on his face. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, just thought I'd drop off Amanda's things," I replied sweetly, noticing the tension between him and Alyssa, who was slouched on the couch with an unmistakable look of defeat. "How's it going, Alyssa?" I asked with exaggerated cheerfulness. She glared at me, mumbling, "Fine." I looked around, noticing the distinct lack of decorations, the bare walls, the general air of disrepair. "Oh my," I said with mock concern. "It looks different from the last time I saw it." Eric shifted uncomfortably, glancing away. "Yeah, well, we're still settling in." I smirked, watching the two of them squirm, and leaned in, my voice soft but dripping with malice. "You know, Eric, it's strange, isn't it? How quickly things can change when you make choices, poor choices, at that." Alyssa, who'd been quiet up until now, snapped. You think you're so much better, don't you, Eleanor? Oh, I don't think I'm better, Alyssa, I replied, feigning innocence. I know I am. I wouldn't betray my family for a temporary fling, and I certainly wouldn't expect someone else to clean up my mess afterward. They both glared at me, but I felt a surge of satisfaction. Well, I'd love to stay and chat, I added, turning to leave, but I have a business to run, a family to take care of. You know, the life you two thought you'd steal from me. Funny, isn't it? How quickly karma catches up. I walked out, leaving them to their empty condo and empty lives. And as I drove away, I felt something lift from my shoulders, a sense of peace that had been missing since that night in the ballroom. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Alyssa had left Eric, finally fed up with the financial struggle and Eric's inability to keep her in the life she'd wanted. I heard she moved back to her hometown, leaving Eric alone and in debt. As for Eric, he'd lost nearly everything. He was living in a cramped apartment, barely scraping by, his career tainted by his own foolish choices. Meanwhile, I was thriving, my business growing by the day, and my life filled with new friends, new experiences, and a sense of independence I'd never had before. One night, while having dinner with Amanda, I raised my glass to her. To us, I said, smiling. To rebuilding, to strength, and to never letting anyone tell us what we're worth. And as she clinked her glass with mine, I knew I'd won. I'd lost the life I thought I wanted, but I'd gained something far better, freedom, self-respect, and a future I could finally call my own.